This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
So when I say the name Karl Marx, what pops into your head? Probably some image of a fiery revolutionary, right? A man of action, a political icon whose ideas shook the world. But what if that picture, the one we all kind of know, isn't the whole story? What if the real Karl Marx was someone else entirely? Because that's the big question we're going to dig into. We're going to peel back the layers on the man behind the monument, and what we find is a very different story. It's one filled with exile, deep analysis, and honestly, a lot of quiet desperation. Okay, so first things first, we have to acknowledge the myth itself. I mean, the image of Marx is huge, it's powerful, he's seen as this father of revolutions, the guy who famously called for the workers of the world to unite. But for a minute, let's try to separate the actual man from the ism that exploded after he was gone. And this slide, well, it lays out the two sides of the coin perfectly. On the one hand, you've got the myth, the fiery agitator, the leader of the masses, the prophet of revolution. But on the other side, well, that's the reality of his life story. An intellectual living in exile, a quiet analyst, a theorist. So let's follow the evidence and see where it takes us. Let's start with his most famous piece of writing, the Communist Manifesto. We usually think of it as Marx's personal, fiery call to arms. But the real story of how it got made back in Brussels is actually a lot more, well, businesslike. So here's the kicker. The manifesto was basically a commissioned gig. You had the client, the Communist League. They had a request. We need a pamphlet that spells out what we believe in. And Marx delivered the product. That intense, get-you-fired-up style, that was part of the job description, what the client needed. The theory underneath was his, for sure, but the packaging was for a very specific audience. He wasn't just yelling into the wind, he was doing a job he was hired to do. So after Brussels, he gets exiled again. This time he lands in Cologne, right smack in the middle of the 1848 revolutions sweeping across Europe. This is where he becomes a newspaper editor, and it's probably the closest he ever got to being a real revolutionary. But as always, context is everything. As the editor of this newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, his main job wasn't really about pushing pure communism. For that one intense year, he was a radical democratic writer. He was attacking the old monarchy, going after feudalism, and pushing for democratic reforms. But in the end, the revolution failed. The paper was shut down, and he was forced into exile yet again. That brief, fiery phase as a public political voice, it was over. And that brings us to the longest, and without a doubt, the most defining chapter of his entire life, his time in London. From 1849 all the way to his death in 1883, he lived there as an exile. And this is where that popular image of Marx just completely falls apart. This wasn't a life of leading movements from the front lines. It was a life of quiet and often desperate work behind a desk. Just think about that for a second. 34 years. The first decade was just brutal. We're talking about soul-crushing poverty and unbelievable family tragedy. It took him almost 20 years in London just to get the first volume of his life's work, Das Kapital, published. And the level of hardship here, it's hard to even imagine. This wasn't some kind of noble, chosen poverty. It was just bleak. He had no steady income. Creditors were constantly repossessing his furniture. At one point, he had to pawn his own coat just to make it through the winter. And most heartbreakingly, when his daughter died, he couldn't even afford a coffin for her. This was the man behind the grand theory. And yet, what did he do almost every single day? He'd escape this grim life by going to the British Museum Library. And there, surrounded by all these books and mountains of data, he wasn't plotting a violent takeover. He was undertaking this massive intellectual project to dissect the entire anatomy of the global capitalist system. And this one little fact just sums up the irony of his life perfectly. Here's a guy analyzing the vast, complex machinery of world economics, and he gets rejected for a simple job as a railway clerk because his handwriting was too messy. He was a thinker, an analyst, totally removed from the practical world he was studying so intensely. So that brings us to his magnum opus, Das Kapital. It's so often treated like it's a revolutionary's handbook, a step-by-step guide on how to bring down the system. But if you actually crack it open and look inside, you find something completely different. The best way to think about it is this. Das Kapital is not a battle plan. It's an autopsy report.
Marx was basically laying the entire system out on a table, identifying all of its parts and explaining in excruciating detail how they all work together. It's a book of diagnosis. This is what is, not a prescription for a cure. This is what you should do. And you can see this in the language of the book itself. It's packed with these dense analytical terms, the commodity forms, surplus value, laws of accumulation. It reads like a scientific textbook because that's what he intended it to be. You'll find almost no commands, no workers, you must do this. The grammar is almost always, this is how it works, not this is what we have to do. So as we get to the end of his life, this contrast between the quiet, isolated man and his incredibly loud, world-changing legacy, well, it becomes just unbelievably stark. So what's with the number 12? Well, that's roughly the number of people who actually showed up to Karl Marx's funeral when he was buried in Highgate Cemetery. Just a dozen people. And that right there is the ultimate paradox, isn't it? Such a quiet, almost forgotten end for a man whose ideas, long after he was gone, would be taken up and used to build nations, to fuel revolutions, and to define global politics for more than a century. And this is really the key takeaway. Marx's actual role wasn't to be the guy leading the charge. He was the analyst in the library. His life's work was to build the theoretical framework that a political movement might someday need. He wrote the blueprint, but he never actually tried to build the building himself. Which, of course, leaves us with one last huge question. If the man himself was this quiet, exiled intellectual who died in relative obscurity, then who or what took his super complex descriptive theories and turned them into Marxism, the political force that actually changed the world? Well, that is a story for another time.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.